White cop from's black woman in court. Has no idea she's a lethal Navy SEAL. Presented by a one-storyteller, where truth confronts power, and the untold becomes unforgettable. Every story we share is rooted in powerful emotion, gritty realism, and the resilience of the human spirit. Today's narrative is one that will grip your heart, twist your gut, and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, courage, and identity. The courtroom was cold, not from the air conditioning, but from something deeper. An indifference baked into its walls, into the stained oak benches and the gaze of those who had long stopped seeing the individuals in front of them. Talia Freeman sat alone at the defendant's table, her dark eyes absorbing every motion, every whisper, every look that glanced past her like she was already guilty. The murmurs weren't loud, but she felt them, coated in disbelief, suspicion, expectation. To them, she was just another black woman facing charges. The details didn't matter. They never did. The suit she wore, pressed and clean, couldn't outshine the unspoken verdict already forming in the eyes of the jury. Her silence was mistaken for fear. Her composure read as defiance. She knew this game, had seen it from the fringes all her life. Her skin color wasn't on trial, but somehow it always was. And as the prosecution smirked and Officer Dalton sat upright like a man already vindicated, Talia gripped her hands beneath the table, not out of nervousness, but restraint. Because it wasn't just her freedom at stake. It was the weight of every sister, every mother, every daughter whose story was swallowed by a justice system that knew their names only when it was time to punish them. They knew their names only when it was time to punish them. That silence, in that stillness, she bore the burden of centuries and the ache of knowing this wasn't a courtroom. It was a battlefield, and truth was already bleeding. He walked like a man who'd been here before and walked out victorious every time, each lie smoother than the last, polished by years of never being questioned. To him, Talia wasn't a person. She was a profile, a statistic, an inconvenience wrapped in skin he didn't respect. He'd written the report before the truth even had a chance to breathe. Aggressive, uncooperative, violent. The buzzwords that always worked. He never wondered about her past, never looked her in the eyes long enough to see the storm behind them. Why would he? The courtroom was his playground, the badge his armor. As he took the stand, reciting his testimony with full gravity, he watched her with a predator's glance, not for fear, but for dominance. His words were wrapped in performance, a script sharpened by years of unchecked authority. But beneath
the smug assurance, the rot had already set in, because for the first time the story he was spinning had an audience that wasn't entirely asleep, and the woman he thought was powerless held a truth sharp enough to pierce through even his most convincing lie. Talia Freeman sat motionless, the calm in her body belying the storm raging inside her. She wasn't nervous, not in the way they thought. What she felt was deeper, heavier, something bone-deep and worn with age. The fatigue of being misread, of being overlooked until it suited them to notice. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. Every stare that lingered too long, every glance that slid off her like she wasn't there, she absorbed it all in quiet defiance. They thought they knew her. They thought the way she sat, so composed, so still, meant she had nothing to say. But Talia had learned long ago that silence could be louder than words, that stillness could be a strategy. When you've spent years navigating rooms where you were both invisible and under a microscope, you learn how to move without making waves, until the moment you decide to. She watched every motion in the courtroom, the subtle exchange between the prosecutor and the officer, The eye rolls, the barely concealed smirks. It was all so familiar. They didn't fear her. They didn't fear her. They didn't respect her. They had already written the ending. What they didn't see, what they never thought to ask, was how many nights she'd slept with sand in her boots and blood on her hands. How many times she'd stood between a bullet and a brother in arms. Her body remembered it all, even if the courtroom refused to. Every beat of her heart carried the weight of battles they couldn't begin to imagine. But she sat quiet. Let them underestimate her. Let them talk, because the truth, her truth, was coming. And when it did, it would not whisper. It would roar. They hadn't looked at her file. Not really. If they had, they'd have known there was something there they couldn't box up or explain away. Her record was sealed, yes, but even a whisper of what was behind it would have made a lesser man hesitate. But Ray Dalton didn't hesitate. He didn't wonder who she was. He didn't ask why she didn't flinch when he barked orders, or why her hands didn't tremble when he cuffed her. He assumed he knew. That's what power does. It teaches you to read the world through one lens and punish anything that doesn't fit the frame. He saw a black woman, alone, unarmed, in a neighborhood he didn't think she belonged in. That was enough. He hadn't even asked her name before the accusations flew. In his report, she was the aggressor, the threat, the one who lunged and resisted. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was he was angry that she didn't cower. Angry that she looked him in the eye and asked him calmly why he was searching her car without cause. Angry that she knew her rights better than he did. And so he lied. He weaponized the assumption that no one would question him and everyone would doubt her. But what he didn't know, what not even the prosecution knew, was that behind that quiet exterior, behind the silence and the grace, was a woman who had endured more than his worst day. She'd taken lives to protect her country, saved others when no one else could. She'd been trained to stay calm under pressure, to read threats in milliseconds, to dismantle danger without breaking a sweat. The courtroom thought she was small. They were wrong. She wasn't small. She was measured. She was measured. And soon, they would learn that she wasn't just another case. She was a reckoning. Elijah Banks sat in his office the night before the trial, flipping through the slim folder that contained the details of State v. Freeman. It was thinner than it should have been, uncomfortably light for a case with charges this heavy. Assault on a law enforcement officer, resisting arrest, disruption of peace. 3 charges that had the potential to crush someone's life, and yet the file felt like a formality, a loose collection of presumptions barely stitched together with legal jargon. He ran his fingers through his short curls, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling, asking the same question he'd been asking since he got the case. Who was Talia Freeman? He had met her once, briefly, in holding. She hadn't spoken much. No visible panic. No desperation. No pleas for help. Just calm, too calm. Her posture was impeccable, her voice deliberate and level. "I didn't assault him," she said. "I didn't resist. That's all I'm prepared to say. For now." Elijah had seen all kinds of reactions from clients. Rage, grief, fear, sometimes even denial. But Talia gave him nothing. Not coldness, just control. Like she knew something he didn't and was waiting for him to catch up. At first, it frustrated him. How could he defend someone who refused to open up? But then that frustration turned to curiosity, and then to a cautious respect. He pulled her arrest photo up again, studying her face. A deep, unreadable stillness lived in her eyes, not the kind born from street toughness or practiced bravado, but from something else, something far more disciplined. Elijah recognized it, vaguely. His older cousin had been a Marine, the kind who never told war stories, who never raised his voice, but whose presence filled a room when he entered. Talia had that same look, that quiet readiness. And yet, there wasn't a single military notation in the file. No service record, no discharge papers. No discharge papers. Just a sealed background and a clean civilian history. The deeper he looked, the more questions he had, but none of that would matter if he couldn't create reasonable doubt. The prosecution had their star witness, Officer Ray Dalton, and the public image to match, clean-cut, articulate, seasoned. On paper, he was a cop trying to do his job who'd been attacked by a hostile woman refusing to comply. The press had already run with it. The local news recycled the narrative like it was gospel. Officer injured in altercation with combative woman during noise complaint response. No name, no context, just the script. And that was what bothered Elijah the most, the script. He'd read it too many times before, in police reports, in court transcripts, in closing arguments from prosecutors who barely concealed their contempt. It always started the same. The suspect matched a description. The suspect matched a description. The suspect was non-compliant. The officer feared for their safety. And just like that, the law bent to accommodate fear. And fear was always easier to justify when the accused was black, especially a black woman who didn't beg or break. The system had perfected it. Elijah knew that if he didn't break this narrative wide open, Talia's silence would be used against her, and the courtroom would fold itself around Dalton's lie until it became the only truth anyone could hear. On the first day of trial, Elijah stood beside Talia as she was called to rise. She wore the same charcoal suit she had during their last meeting. No jewelry, no expression. The courtroom was filled, half the jury already leaning into their own silent prejudices. The judge, Eleanor Hightower, a woman known for her strict adherence to decorum, surveyed the room like a chessboard, watching how each piece moved. Dalton entered with confidence, a hero returning to collect his vindication. He wore his uniform, sharp and pressed, the badge on his chest gleaming under the courtroom lights. The prosecutor greeted him like an old friend. His story had been told before, in other words, with other faces. This time, it was just new characters. Just new characters. When Dalton took the stand, he delivered his testimony with practiced ease. He described the alleged escalation, claimed Talia had been aggressive, uncooperative, verbally hostile. He painted her as a threat, someone who had turned a routine call into chaos. And he emphasized one line in particular, "I feared for my life." That phrase hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Elijah knew the damage it could do, knew that for many in that room, it was all they needed to justify whatever happened next. Fear had become a weapon in the mouths of men like Dalton, crafted carefully, deployed surgically. It turned victims into villains and made truth irrelevant. But what struck Elijah most as Dalton spoke was how confidently he lied. There was no hesitation, no crack in his voice, no shame. He believed without a shadow of a doubt that the system would protect him, that no one would question his account because they never had before. That was the most dangerous part, not the lie itself, but the certainty behind. The arrogance of someone who had learned time and again that his word would always outweigh a black woman's truth. Elijah glanced at Talia. She didn't blink. She didn't react. It was as if she had seen this performance before and was watching it again, just waiting for her cue to interrupt the show. He wanted to ask her, "Why are you waiting? What are you holding back?" But something in her silence told him that the timing mattered. That she was calculating every move, every angle, like a soldier measuring her terrain. So he waited too, trusted her, even if he didn't yet understand why. As Dalton left the stand, still smug, still confident, Elijah knew he had his work cut out for him. He couldn't rely on theatrics or outrage. He had to unravel the lie, thread by thread, in front of a jury trained to believe it. And the only person who could help him do that, the only one who held the missing piece, was the woman beside him who had said so little, but somehow carried more weight in her silence than Dalton ever could with all his polished words. Elijah stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision as he approached the defense table. He turned to Talia and whispered, "It's time." She gave a single nod, then rose to take the stand. The room shifted. Juries leaned forward. Even Dalton, arms folded, narrowed his eyes with an unease he hadn't shown before. Talia sat, adjusted the microphone, and spoke with a voice calm as still water, but carrying weight like thunder. She introduced herself, not just as Talia Freeman, the accused, but as Chief Petty Officer Freeman, Navy SEAL, 12 years active duty, with a service record that had been sealed for security reasons. Murmurs rippled through the room. Judge Hightower raised an eyebrow. Elijah handed the court clerk a set of documents marked unsealed with authorization. The file revealed medals, combat deployments, high-clearance missions, proof not just of service, but of honor, control, discipline. The courtroom, so sure of her guilt, had not imagined this version of her could exist, much less sit silently while being labeled a criminal. Dalton's face twitched, his jaw tightening as the weight of her truth began to sink in. Dalton's smirk, the one he had worn like armor since the first moment he entered the courtroom, began to falter. As Talia spoke with quiet precision about her military background, her SEAL training, and her experience diffusing real threats in war zones far more volatile than a neighborhood noise complaint, something shifted. She wasn't boasting. There was no bravado in her tone, no desire to impress. She spoke like a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to protect, including her integrity. The jury, once distant and passive, began to see her differently, not just as a defendant, but as someone who had carried the weight of service in silence. Dalton's mouth tightened. Oh. He looked to the prosecution for reassurance, but none came. His story no longer stood unopposed. Then came the footage. The segment of body cam video Dalton claimed had malfunctioned was recovered from the department's cloud storage. It didn't show the entire encounter, but it was enough. Talia's calm voice asking for the reason behind the stop, her hands visible and raised, her tone measured. No aggression, no threat. The video didn't match the report. And just like that, doubt took root, not just in the jury's mind, but in the very structure of Dalton's carefully crafted lie. The next morning, the courtroom lights seemed to burn a little brighter, as if the truth that had begun to leak in through the cracks was now illuminating everything. Elijah had one final surprise, and as the judge gave him the floor, he called a name that meant nothing to the jury, Corporal Javier Mendez. The door opened, and in walked a man whose very presence seemed to command silence. Mendez wore his uniform with quiet pride, medals gleaming, shoulders squared. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was steady, deep, and filled with a reverence that no courtroom could diminish. He spoke of war zones, of nights when death crept close, and only those with unwavering discipline survived. He spoke of Talia, not as a defendant, not even as a fellow SEAL, but as the one who saved his life. She didn't just serve, he said. She led. She commanded respect. She walked into the fire so the rest of us could walk out. The room was silent, held hostage by the gravity of his words. He detailed her precision, her calm in chaos, her unmatched ability to de-escalate even the most volatile situations. Not with force, but with clarity. And then he turned toward Dalton. "I wasn't there that night, officer," Mendez said, his voice sharp. "But I've stood beside Chief Freeman in places most people wouldn't survive 10 minutes. She's the most composed, deliberate, honorable person I've ever known. If she didn't escalate, then nothing was escalated. If she said you lied, I believe her." The prosecution tried to object, to question his credibility, but every attempt fell flat against the immovable truth of his testimony. Dalton's eyes dropped for the first time. The man who had strutted into the courtroom now shifted in his chair, his confidence draining with every word spoken by the soldier who knew Talia better than any report ever could. The power dynamic flipped. The room that once viewed Talia as suspect now saw her as protector, leader, survivor. And Dalton, who had been so sure of the narrative he spun, now sat under the same scrutiny he once weaponized. The jury watched him with narrowed eyes, no longer receptive to his false charm. The judge leaned forward, her fingers steepled, no longer indifferent. Ooh. The truth had changed everything. Not just the facts of the case, but the roles in the room. Talia was no longer the accused. She was the anchor of integrity in a space built to unravel her. And Dalton, who once wielded lies like a shield, now found himself exposed, his badge no longer able to mask the cracks forming beneath his story. Elijah stood, facing the jury with a gravity that needed no theatrics. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or pound his fist. He let the silence do the work. "What does it take," he asked gently, "for a black woman to be believed?" The question hung in the air like a weight dropped from the rafters. He turned to Talia, who sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes calm. "You've heard the officer's version of events. You've seen the footage. You've listened to testimony from someone who fought beside Miss Freeman in some of the most dangerous corners of this world. So now I ask, why was her truth so easy to overlook?" He walked toward the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. Because she didn't yell? Because she didn't fight back? Because she sat here in silence while others tried to define her story for her? His voice softened. Or maybe because we're too used to a justice system that listens to the loudest voice, not the truest one. A system that mistakes silence for guilt, composure for arrogance. Inside was a medal she never displayed, earned during a mission no one ever talked about. Not because it wasn't worth telling, but because the world wouldn't have understood. Now, maybe someone finally would. Elijah visited her that evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee and nothing rehearsed to say. They sat in quiet companionship, the way soldiers sometimes sit without needing to speak. He looked at her, this woman who had held the line not just in war, but in a courtroom designed to erase her. He saw in her not just a client, but a mirror reflecting a truth often hidden, black resilience not born from defiance, but from unshakable grace. As night fell, they sat on her small balcony, watching the city lights blink quietly beneath them, neither needing to name what had changed, only knowing it had. Weeks passed, but the echoes of the trial didn't fade. They deepened. Whispers spread in the precinct, growing louder than any siren. Some officers lowered their voices when Dalton walked by. Others turned their backs entirely. He had become the cautionary tale, the one who flew too close to impunity and got burned by truth. Internal Affairs launched a quiet investigation, and the mayor's office, once silent, began reviewing police conduct cases long buried. Dalton tried to hold on to his image, but it slipped each day like dust through clenched fists. His authority no longer landed with force, it trembled under doubt. The badge on his chest, once shining, now reflected back a face the city no longer trusted. Meanwhile, Talia found herself at a crossroads not marked by fear, but by possibility. A local community center reached out, asking her to speak to young women about service, survival, and what it meant to carry power without violence. She stood before them one evening, her presence quiet yet undeniable. The room held its breath as she spoke, not of warfare or headlines, but of dignity, of being underestimated, of the strength it takes to not fight when every instinct begs for battle. She wasn't telling them how to be strong. She was showing them. A girl in the front row, no older than 16, wiped away a tear as Talia spoke about silence not being weakness, but a weapon, one that carried truth like a blade. And in that moment, the pain that had once tried to bury her became something else entirely, legacy. Months later, Talia received a letter in a crisp envelope with the Department of Justice seal embossed in silver. It wasn't just an acknowledgement, it was an apology, formal, restrained, but there in writing. Words she had never expected to read. We failed to protect you. We failed to believe you." Alongside it came a request for her to join a new oversight initiative on use of force reform. They didn't ask her to relive what happened. They asked her to help change what could no longer continue. She stared at the letter for a long time before placing it beside the medal she'd once tucked away. So, the two things didn't cancel each other out. They existed together now, each a scar, each a step. Dalton, suspended pending investigation, spent his days in forced quiet. The uniform still hung in his closet, untouched, while his name slowly vanished from precinct briefings, from handshakes at the coffee shop, from the trust he once carried like a shield. He had underestimated Talia in a way that wasn't just personal, it was institutional. He had bet on a system that had always leaned his way and lost. And what haunted him most wasn't the verdict, but the memory of her silence in the courtroom, how she hadn't needed a rage to dismantle him. Just truth. Meanwhile, Talia took the podium at a national symposium on justice reform, invited not as a guest, but as a keynote voice. She didn't speak with vengeance, she spoke with vision. Her words traced the blueprint for a system where dignity isn't a luxury, where truth isn't buried beneath fear, where resilience isn't the price of being believed. In the audience were young attorneys, officers, activists, victims, and survivors. Some took notes, others just listened, breathing in the quiet power of a woman who had walked through the fire and built a path behind her. Each sentence she spoke made space for healing, for reckoning, for change. And for the first time in a long time, the room didn't feel like a fight. It felt like a beginning. Talia stood alone one evening in the quiet of the community center's rooftop, the city's hum rising beneath her like a distant heartbeat. She could see the courthouse from here, small and unassuming in the vast urban sprawl. And yet it had held the weight of her life in its walls not long ago. The sky above her was streaked with fading orange and deepening blue, and for the first time in years, she felt herself truly breathing. No combat gear, no courtroom glare, no silence forced by strategy. Just the air of a woman who had survived being erased and still chose to speak. A group of young girls from her self-defense class lingered below, their laughter echoing faintly, full of something she had once thought she might never hear again: safety. They didn't know the fullness of what she had endured, not yet. But they knew who she was, not the headlines, not the charges. They knew the woman who taught them how to stand tall without throwing a punch, who taught them that power isn't always noise, that dignity is sometimes the loudest weapon in a broken room. One girl, no older than 11, had drawn a picture she shyly handed Talia earlier that day. It showed a woman in uniform, her hand outstretched, shielding a younger girl from a shadow behind her. Underneath, scrawled in uneven pencil, were the words, "You make us safe." Talia had folded it slowly, carefully, and placed it in her coat pocket next to her military ID. Two identities she once thought the world would never let her hold at once: protector and woman, defender and human being, now nestled together, unashamed. In the distance, the news continued. Stories of other trials, other names, other black women still waiting to be heard. Talia didn't believe her story was a finish line. It was a flare shot into the night sky, a signal that someone had lived, endured, and refused to vanish. And if that light reached even one person still sitting in silence, still being framed, doubted, dismissed, then maybe it had done what it was meant to do. Not erase the pain, but prove it was never for nothing. Across the arc of these 26 keynotes, we have walked a road carved in silence and lit by courage. We have watched as a woman, framed, accused, and nearly buried beneath falsehood, rose not by screaming, but by standing. Talia Freeman did not just survive injustice. She redefined what survival looks like. She reminded a broken system that grace under fire is more powerful than fury, and that stillness can be its own form of resistance. We've seen a badge lose its meaning when wielded as a weapon. We've witnessed how lies unravel not in explosions, but in the gentle persistence of truth. From the courtroom tension to the hush of the community center's rooftop, this story hasn't just explored a single case, it's excavated the roots of racial bias, of what it means to be heard, and what it costs to be doubted simply for the color of your skin. The lessons run deep. The lessons run deep. Justice is not a favor, it is a right. Power must be held accountable, not worshipped. And most of all, silence is not the absence of a voice. It is sometimes the clearest, most deafening call for truth. Talia's journey is not about one verdict or one victory. It's about legacy. It's about legacy. It's about what happens when the underestimated refuse to be erased. When a woman once silenced becomes a voice for others, still waiting in the shadows. And so, we close this chapter not with celebration, but with reverence for every unspoken fight, every quiet act of defiance, and every truth waiting its turn to be seen. You've just heard the kind of story that leaves a mark. If it moved you, don't let it end here. Like, comment, share, and join us at A1 Storyteller, where the truth doesn't whisper, it roars.